The night was colder than usual, and the streets were wrapped in an eerie silence. Detective Ryan Cole tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he glanced at his partner, Officer Maria Alvarez, sitting beside him. They had been patrolling the same route for hours, their police cruiser crawling along the empty roads of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The only sounds breaking the stillness were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves caught in the icy wind. "This is boring," Maria muttered, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. "I swear, if I see one more raccoon rummaging through trash cans, I'm calling it quits." Ryan chuckled softly but kept his focus sharp. He liked these quiet nights. It gave him time to think. As they turned onto Maple Street, heading toward the outskirts of town, something caught Ryan's eye. An old, dilapidated warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows staring back like hollow eyes. It wasn't unusual to find abandoned buildings in this part of the city, but there was something about this place that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Remember that tip we got last month?" Ryan asked, slowing the car down. "About drug dealers using this area." Maria nodded. "Yeah, but nothing ever came of it. Just rumors." Still, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He parked the cruiser near the entrance of the warehouse and turned off the engine. The silence outside was almost suffocating. Grabbing their flashlights, the two officers stepped out of the car, their boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. As they approached the building, Ryan held up a hand, signaling for Maria to stay close. The heavy metal door creaked open with a groan, revealing a dark, musty interior. The air smelled damp and stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. But then, just as they were about to turn back, they heard it, a faint whimper. "What was that?" Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he pointed his flashlight deeper into the shadows, scanning the room. The sound came again, louder this time. Unmistakably the cry of an animal. Without hesitation, the two officers moved forward, their footsteps echoing through the empty space. The whimpering grew more desperate, guiding them toward a corner where piles of debris lay scattered across the floor. And then they saw it. A dog, chained to a rusted pipe, trembling violently in the cold. Its fur was matted and dirty, its ribs visible beneath the thin layer of skin. The poor creature looked up at them with wide, fearful eyes, yet there was a flicker of hope in its gaze. Ryan knelt down slowly, speaking in a soft, reassuring tone, while Maria called animal control. But even as they worked to comfort the frightened animal, both officers couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that something darker lurked behind this discovery. Why would someone leave a dog here, alone and starving? What secrets did this forgotten warehouse hold? For now, all they could do was wait, and wonder what story this battered canine might tell. The sight of the trembling dog chained to the rusted pipe was enough to make anyone's heart ache. Detective Ryan Cole knelt closer, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle a frightened animal. The German Shepherd, once a proud and strong breed, was now a shadow of its former self. Its fur was tangled with dirt, some patches missing entirely, revealing raw, irritated skin underneath. The dog's eyes darted nervously between Ryan and Officer Maria Alvarez, who stood nearby, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke urgently with animal control. Ryan reached out cautiously, letting the dog sniff his hand before gently resting it on its head. The dog flinched at first, but didn't pull away. Instead, it let out another soft whimper, almost like a plea for help. "It's okay, buddy," Ryan murmured, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside him. Whoever had done this would have a lot to answer for. Maria hung up the phone and crouched beside Ryan. "Animal control is on their way, but they said it'll take about 20 minutes. She glanced around the dimly lit warehouse, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "This place gives me the creeps." As they waited, they began to take in more details of the scene. There was no food or water in sight, just a pile of old, tattered blankets that smelled faintly of mildew. One of them was soaked with what looked like dried blood. Ryan's jaw tightened as he examined the chain around the dog's neck. It was heavy and rusted, digging into the poor creature's skin. He couldn't imagine how long it had been here, suffering in silence. But something felt off. This wasn't just neglect, it was calculated cruelty. As Maria shone her flashlight around the area, she noticed something tucked under one of the blankets. Pulling it free, she revealed a small box filled with medical supplies. Bandages, antiseptic wipes, even a few used syringes. Her brow furrowed. "Whoever left these things here knew what they were doing," she said, holding up a half-empty bottle of antibiotic ointment. "They were trying to treat the dog." Ryan frowned, looking back at the injured animal. So why leave him like this? If they cared enough to patch him up, why abandon him? Their questions deepened when Maria spotted a crumpled notebook lying near the supplies. She picked it up carefully, flipping through its pages. Each entry was written in hurried, uneven handwriting, detailing the dog's injuries and treatment progress. Some entries mentioned giving the dog painkillers. Others talked about cleaning wounds and monitoring his recovery. At the bottom of each page, the same name appeared: Ethan. "Who's Ethan?" Maria asked, showing the notebook to Ryan. He shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know, but I think we're going to find out." The dog let out another weak whimper, drawing their attention back to him. Despite everything, there was still a spark of life in those sad eyes, a glimmer of trust that made Ryan's chest tighten. Whoever had left this dog behind had done so for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it clearly weighed heavily on them. For now, all they could do was wait for animal control to arrive and ensure the dog received the care it desperately needed. But both officers knew this case wasn't over, not by a long shot. Something about this situation didn't add up, and they were determined to uncover the truth. Little did they know, the story behind the dog's suffering would be far more heartbreaking than they could have imagined. Back at the police station, Detective Ryan Cole sat hunched over his desk, the crumpled notebook open in front of him. The handwriting was messy but heartfelt, each entry filled with concern and care for the dog named Max. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had written these words wasn't some heartless abuser. They were someone who cared deeply, yet something had gone terribly wrong. "Ethan," Ryan muttered under his breath, tapping the name on the page. He turned to his computer and started running a search. It didn't take long before he found a match. Ethan Parker, a 34-year-old Army veteran who had served 2 tours overseas. According to public records, Ethan had returned home 5 years ago after being honorably discharged. But life hadn't been kind to him since then. Struggling with PTSD and unable to hold down steady work, Ethan had fallen into financial hardship. His last known address was an apartment he'd been evicted from over unpaid rent. Maria walked in just as Ryan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Anything?" she asked, setting down 2 cups of coffee. Ryan nodded, gesturing toward the screen. "Meet Ethan Parker. He's a vet, served in Afghanistan. Looks like he's been through hell. Evictions, medical bills, you name it." Maria frowned, picking up the notebook again. So this guy took care of Max while things fell apart around him. But why leave the dog behind? That doesn't make sense. Ryan sighed. Maybe he thought he had no choice. Let's dig deeper. They decided to visit the neighborhood where Ethan used to live. The building manager recognized Ethan immediately when shown a photo. "Yeah, I remember him," the man said, scratching his chin. "Quiet guy, kept mostly to himself. Always had that big dog with him, though. Never caused any trouble." "What happened?" Maria pressed gently. The manager shrugged. "He stopped paying rent about 6 months ago. Said he'd lost his job. I gave him extra time, but eventually I had to ask him to leave. Haven't seen him since." A neighbor offered more insight. An elderly woman named Mrs. Harper recalled seeing Ethan and Max often. "That poor boy loved that dog more than anything," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "I used to see them walking together late at night. Sometimes they'd sit on the curb outside my building. You could tell the dog meant everything to him. Did you notice anything unusual? Ryan asked. Mrs. Harper hesitated, then nodded. About 3 months ago, I saw him packing stuff into a backpack one evening. He looked broken, like he'd given up. I tried talking to him, but he just said he needed to go somewhere and promised he'd come back for the dog. But he never did. Maria exchanged a glance with Ryan. This wasn't adding up. If Ethan cared so much about Max, why abandon him in such brutal conditions? Something must have pushed him to the edge. Their next stop was a local shelter that assisted homeless veterans. A counselor there confirmed Ethan had sought help briefly, but disappeared shortly afterward. No one knew where he went or what happened to him. As they pieced together Ethan's story, Ryan felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just about finding a missing person. It was about understanding the weight of despair that could drive someone to leave behind their closest companion. And if they wanted answers, they needed to find Ethan himself. "We'll find him," Maria said firmly, sensing Ryan's frustration. "For Max's sake, we have to." Ryan nodded, determination hardening in his eyes. They were getting closer to the truth, but every new detail only deepened the mystery. What had driven Ethan to walk away from the dog, who clearly meant the world to him? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets, Detective Ryan Cole and Officer Maria Alvarez sat in their cruiser, reviewing everything they had uncovered about Ethan Parker. The more they learned, the heavier the story seemed to weigh on them. This wasn't just a case of neglect or abandonment. It was a tragedy shaped by circumstances far beyond what most people could imagine. Ethan's life after the military had been a slow unraveling. Records showed he'd struggled to adjust to civilian life, battling PTSD and the haunting memories of war. He'd bounced between low-paying jobs, often unable to keep them due to anxiety attacks or flashbacks. Friends and acquaintances described him as quiet, reserved, and deeply loyal, qualities that made his bond with Max all the more poignant. Max hadn't always been part of Ethan's life. According to Mrs. Harper, the elderly neighbor, Ethan had found the dog injured on the side of the road years ago. At the time, Max was little more than a scrawny stray with a broken leg and a coat matted with dirt. But Ethan took him in, nursing him back to health despite his own struggles. For Ethan, Max became more than just a pet. He was family, a lifeline in a world that felt increasingly hostile. "Think about it," Maria said softly as they drove toward another lead. For someone like Ethan, who probably didn't trust many people, having Max by his side must have meant everything. That dog gave him purpose. Ryan nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "And now look at where we are. Max is fighting for his life, and Ethan's vanished without a trace. Something had to give. But what?" Their next stop was a small community center that offered free meals and resources to homeless individuals. The staff there remembered Ethan vividly. One volunteer, a kind-eyed woman named Linda, explained how Ethan would occasionally bring Max with him. "He never asked for much," she said. "Just some food and maybe a blanket if it got too cold. But you could tell he was struggling." He talked sometimes about how hard it was to take care of Max when he couldn't even take care of himself. Linda paused, her expression pained. "About 3 months ago, he stopped coming. We thought maybe he'd gotten back on his feet, but then I heard rumors. People said he left because he couldn't afford to feed Max anymore. He was scared the dog would get taken away or worse." The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was heartbreaking. It wasn't neglect, it was sacrifice. Ethan had done everything he could to protect Max, even treating his injuries with whatever supplies he could scrounge up. But eventually, the weight of his situation became too much to bear. Leaving Max behind in the warehouse must have felt like the only option, a desperate attempt to ensure the dog survived even if Ethan couldn't. Maria leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. "Do you think he planned to come back for Max? Or did he just break?" Ryan stared out the window, watching the blur of streetlights pass by. I don't know. But I do know one thing. Wherever Ethan is, he's carrying around a mountain of guilt. And if we want answers, we need to find him, not just for our sake, but for Max. Their search wasn't over yet. Every clue brought them closer to understanding the depth of Ethan's struggle and the impossible choice he'd been forced to make. As they continued their investigation, both officers couldn't help but wonder, what would they say to Ethan when they finally found him? And would he ever be able to forgive himself for leaving behind the one creature who loved him unconditionally? Detective Ryan Cole and Officer Maria Alvarez were determined to track down Ethan Parker, but finding a man who didn't want to be found was proving to be a daunting task. They spent hours combing through shelters, hospitals, and outreach programs for veterans, piecing together fragments of information that might lead them to him. Each new detail painted a clearer picture of Ethan's downward spiral, his growing isolation, his inability to cope with the weight of his circumstances, and a heartbreaking decision to leave Max behind. Their breakthrough came unexpectedly at a bus station on the outskirts of the city. It was late in the evening, and the station was nearly empty except for a few travelers waiting for their rides. As Ryan and Maria approached the ticket counter, they showed the clerk a photo of Ethan. The young woman behind the desk studied it for a moment before nodding hesitantly. "Yeah, I've seen him," she said quietly. "He comes here sometimes, just sits in the corner. Looks like he's waiting for something, or someone." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. "Is he here now?" The clerk pointed toward a dimly lit bench near the back of the station. Sure enough, there he was, Ethan Parker. He looked nothing like the photos they'd seen earlier. His once sturdy frame was gaunt, his face hollowed out by exhaustion and despair. A scruffy beard covered his jawline, and his clothes hung loosely on his body, as if they belonged to someone else. He sat hunched over, clutching a worn backpack tightly against his chest, staring blankly at the floor. Maria exchanged a glance with Ryan. This was it, the moment they'd been working toward. But as they approached Ethan, they could see how fragile he was. His hands trembled slightly, and his eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding contact with anyone nearby. When Ryan finally spoke, his voice was calm and gentle. "Ethan, we're with the police. Can we talk to you for a minute?" Ethan froze, his breath hitching audibly. For a second, it seemed like he might bolt, but instead, he slowly raised his head, meeting Ryan's gaze. There was no defiance in his expression, only fear and guilt, etched deeply into every line of his face. I didn't do anything wrong," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're not here about that," Maria assured him, crouching down to his level so she wouldn't seem intimidating. "We found Max." At the mention of the dog's name, Ethan's entire demeanor changed. His shoulders slumped, and tears welled up in his bloodshot eyes. "Max," he choked out, covering his face with his hands. "Oh God, Max." Ryan pulled up a chair beside him while Maria kept her distance, giving Ethan space to process. "We need to understand what happened," Ryan said softly. "Why did you leave him there?" Ethan shook his head, his voice trembling as he began to speak. I couldn't take care of him anymore. I tried. Okay, I really tried. But I couldn't even feed myself half the time, let alone him. Every day felt like I was failing him more and more." He paused, swallowing hard. "I thought if I left him somewhere safe, maybe someone would find him. Maybe he'd have a chance at a better life than the one I could give him." His words hung heavy in the air. Maria felt a lump rise in her throat as she listened. This wasn't a man who had abandoned his dog out of cruelty. It was a man who believed he had failed the one creature he loved most. Ryan leaned forward, his tone firm but compassionate. "Ethan, Max is alive. He's hurt, but he's getting better, and he needs you now more than ever." Ethan's head snapped up, his red-rimmed eyes wide with disbelief. He's okay." Ryan nodded. "But he won't fully heal until you're part of his life again. Will you come with us? Let us help you both." For the first time in months, Ethan allowed himself to hope. The drive to the Animal Rescue Center was quiet, but it carried a weight of anticipation. Ethan sat in the back seat of the police cruiser, his hands gripping the edges of his backpack like it was a lifeline. Detective Ryan Cole and Officer Maria Alvarez exchanged occasional glances in the rearview mirror, watching as Ethan's emotions shifted between hope and fear. For months, he had convinced himself that Max was better off without him, that leaving the dog behind was the only way to save him. Now, faced with the possibility of seeing Max again, Ethan didn't know how to feel. When they arrived at the rescue center, a small nonprofit tucked into a cozy corner of the city, Ethan hesitated before stepping out of the car. His legs felt shaky, and his breath came in short bursts. Ryan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Take your time," he said gently. "This is a good thing, Ethan. Trust us." Inside, the warmth of the building enveloped them. The scent of clean floors and fresh hay filled the air, and the sound of barking dogs echoed softly down the hallways. A volunteer greeted them warmly and led the group to a private room where Max had been staying during his recovery. As they approached the door, Ethan stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. "Are you ready?" Maria asked softly, her voice full of encouragement. Ethan nodded, though his hands trembled as he reached for the doorknob. When he pushed the door open, the sight that greeted him nearly brought him to his knees. There was Max, lying on a soft blanket in the corner of the room. The dog looked thinner than Ethan remembered, his fur still patchy in places, but his eyes, those same loyal, loving eyes, lit up instantly when he saw Ethan. Max let out a weak bark and wagged his tail, struggling to stand despite his weakened state. Ethan dropped to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "Max. Oh, Max, I'm so sorry." The dog limped toward him, pressing his nose against Ethan's chest and licking his cheeks. Ethan wrapped his arms around Max tightly, sobbing uncontrollably. "I thought I lost you forever," he murmured, burying his face in the dog's neck. Ryan and Maria stood silently by the doorway, giving Ethan and Max their moment. It was clear that the bond between them was unbreakable, forged through years of hardship and unconditional love. Watching the reunion, Maria wiped a tear from her own eye, while Ryan crossed his arms, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. After several minutes, Ethan finally pulled back, looking at Max with a mix of guilt and determination. "I promise I'll never leave you again," he said firmly, his voice cracking. "Never." The staff at the rescue center explained Max's condition to Ethan. The wounds were healing well, but he needed continued care and proper nutrition to regain his strength. Ethan listened intently, nodding along as if memorizing every word. When the conversation turned to what would happen next, Ryan stepped forward. "We've arranged temporary housing for you through a veteran support program," he explained. "They can help with counseling, job placement, and other resources, and we'll make sure Max stays with you throughout the process." Ethan blinked in disbelief. "You'd really do that? After everything?" Maria smiled warmly. "You're not alone anymore, Ethan. We'll get you and Max back on your feet together." For the first time in months, Ethan allowed himself to believe that life could improve. With Max by his side and people willing to help, he felt a flicker of hope reignite within him, a fragile flame, but one worth protecting. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change for Ethan and Max, each day bringing new challenges but also small victories. Thanks to Detective Ryan Cole and Officer Maria Alvarez, Ethan was enrolled in a veteran support program designed to help struggling former service members rebuild their lives. The program provided temporary housing, a modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and connected Ethan with counselors who specialized in PTSD. For the first time in years, Ethan had access to consistent care, not just for himself, but for Max as well. Max's recovery progressed steadily under the watchful eyes of veterinarians and volunteers at the rescue center. His physical wounds healed, and his energy slowly returned. By the time Ethan moved into his new apartment, Max was strong enough to join him. On the day they reunited permanently, Ethan knelt on the living room floor, tears streaming down his face as Max bounded toward him, tail wagging furiously. "You're home now, boy," Ethan whispered, hugging the dog tightly. "We're home." But rebuilding their lives wasn't easy. Ethan faced daily reminders of the struggles that had nearly broken him. Simple tasks like grocery shopping or paying bills overwhelmed him at times, and there were nights when sleep eluded him entirely, haunted by memories of war and the guilt of leaving Max behind. Yet every morning, Max would nuzzle against him, grounding him in the present moment. That unwavering loyalty gave Ethan the strength to keep going. Maria and Ryan stayed involved, checking in regularly to ensure both man and dog were adjusting well. They'd brought food, household essentials, and even a cozy dog bed donated by a local pet store. Their efforts didn't stop there. They rallied the community, organizing fundraisers to cover Ethan's initial expenses and connect him with job opportunities. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Margaret, offered to walk Max when Ethan had counseling sessions, saying she admired how much he'd sacrificed for his dog. Ethan began attending therapy twice a week, slowly unpacking the emotional baggage he'd carried since returning from Afghanistan. At first, he found it difficult to open up, but his therapist encouraged him to talk about Max. "He saved you just as much as you saved him," she said during one session. Those words stuck with Ethan, helping him see their bond as a source of healing rather than pain. Meanwhile, Max became something of a local celebrity. Stories of his rescue and reunion with Ethan spread through the community, inspiring others to support veterans and their pets. A nearby animal shelter invited Ethan to speak at an adoption event, where he shared his story with a crowd of strangers. Standing beside Max, Ethan spoke haltingly but honestly about the importance of compassion and second chances. When he finished, the audience erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. As months passed, Ethan started taking steps toward independence. With Maria's encouragement, he applied for a part-time position at a hardware store owned by another veteran. The owner hired him on the spot, impressed by Ethan's determination to turn his life around. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave Ethan a sense of purpose and a paycheck to start covering his own expenses. One evening, as Ethan sat on the couch with Max curled up at his feet, he realized something profound. He wasn't the same man who had walked away from the warehouse all those months ago. He still had scars, both visible and invisible, but they no longer defined him. With Max by his side and a supportive community cheering him on, he was learning to believe in himself again. Ryan stopped by unannounced one afternoon, bringing pizza and a six-pack of soda. As they ate together, Ethan thanked him, not just for finding Max, but for believing in him when he couldn't believe in himself. "I don't know what I did to deserve this," Ethan admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "You deserved it because you never gave up on Max," Ryan replied simply. "And we weren't about to give up on you." For the first time in a long time, Ethan smiled, not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude. Life was far from perfect, but for the first time in years, it felt hopeful. Months turned into a year, and the transformation in Ethan and Max was nothing short of remarkable. The once gaunt dog now had a shiny coat, his muscles strong and lean from daily walks around the neighborhood. Max's playful energy returned in full force, bounding after tennis balls and greeting strangers with wagging enthusiasm. He became a fixture at the local park, where kids would flock to pet him and marvel at his size and gentleness. For Ethan, watching Max thrive filled him with pride and a deep sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Ethan, too, was unrecognizable from the broken man who had sat alone on that bus station bench. His therapist often praised his progress, noting how much more grounded and hopeful he seemed. Therapy sessions were no longer battles against despair, but opportunities for growth and reflection. Ethan even started volunteering at the same animal shelter that had cared for Max, sharing his story with others who struggled with feelings of failure or isolation. "If I can make it through," he'd tell them, "so can you." The community rallied around Ethan and Max, offering support in ways both big and small. Neighbors brought over homemade meals when Ethan worked late shifts at the hardware store. Margaret continued walking Max whenever Ethan needed help, her own loneliness eased by the companionship of the loyal dog. Even Ryan and Maria stayed involved, dropping by occasionally to check in, not as officers, but as friends. They brought updates about fundraisers held in honor of Ethan and Max's story, which had inspired countless donations to veteran and animal welfare programs across the city. One sunny Saturday morning, Ethan stood outside the community center where he'd first spoken publicly about his journey. This time, however, he wasn't just an attendee. He was the keynote speaker at an event celebrating resilience and second chances. As he walked onto the stage with Max by his side, the audience erupted into applause, some standing to cheer. Ethan took a deep breath, gripping the microphone tightly. A year ago, he began, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his chest. I thought my life was over. I thought I'd failed everyone, especially Max. But today, I know better. Today, I know that sometimes, failing is just the first step toward finding your way back. He paused, looking down at Max, who sat obediently beside him, ears perked up as if listening intently. This dog saved me, Ethan continued, not because he did anything extraordinary, but because he loved me when I didn't think I deserved love. And because of him, and people like Detective Cole and Officer Alvarez, I learned that asking for help isn't weakness, it's strength. By the end of his speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. People lined up afterward to thank Ethan, many sharing their own struggles and expressing gratitude for his courage in speaking out. One woman handed him a folded note that read, "Your story gave me hope. Thank you." As the months went on, Ethan and Max settled into a rhythm of stability and joy. Ethan's job at the hardware store led to a promotion, giving him financial security he hadn't known in years. With that stability came confidence. He began taking classes online, exploring interests he'd long neglected. Max remained his constant companion, joining him for study sessions and curling up at his feet during late-night cramming. Their bond remained unshakable, a testament to the power of unconditional love and perseverance. Together, they proved that even in the darkest moments, there's always a glimmer of light waiting to guide you forward, if you're willing to reach for it. And so, Ethan and Max's story became a beacon of hope for anyone facing hardship. Through kindness, determination, and the unwavering support of those around them, they showed that healing is possible, even after the deepest wounds.